small, all things wise and wonderful, the Lord God made them all. The cold wind in the winter, the pleasant summer sun, the ripe fruits in the garden, He made them every one. All things bright and beautiful, creatures great and small, all things wise and wonderful, the Lord God made them all. He gave us eyes to see them, and lips that we might tell how great is God Almighty, who has made all things well. All things bright and beautiful, creatures great and small, all things wise and wonderful, the Lord God made them all. Yes, for me, He careth with loving tender care. Yes, with me, He shareth each burden and each fear. Yes, for me, He watcheth, ceaseless watcheth night and day. Yes, in me, He snatcheth from perils of the way. Yes, for me, He standeth pleading at mercy's seat above, ever for me interceding in love, untiring love. Yes, in me, O God, He sheddeth joys unearthly, love and light, and to cover me He spreadeth His loving wings of might. Yes, in me, He dwelleth, in me, and I in Him, and my soul with hope He filleth, though future plans are dim. Thus I wait for His returning, singing of the way to Him. Such the joyful song of morning, such tranquil song of Him. Though I through the valley of shadow, or mountain or troubled sea, and oft in the darkness have traveled, the Lord has been mindful of me. The Lord has been mindful of me. He blesses and blesses again. My God is the God of the living. How excellent is His name. Much more than my grief and my sorrow, much more than adversity, much more than the all I have given, the Lord has been my children never be a friend to me. Hold my hand and always keep me close to thee. The little flower that opens, the little bird that sings, God made their glowing colors, He made their tiny wings. All things bright and beautiful, creatures great and small, all things wise and wonderful, the Lord God made them all. The cold wind in the winter, the pleasant summer sun, the ripe fruits in the garden, He made them every one. All things bright and beautiful, creatures great and small, all things wise and wonderful, the Lord God made them all. He gave us eyes to see them, and lips that we might tell how great is God Almighty, who has made all things well. All things bright and beautiful, creatures great and small, all things wise and wonderful, the Lord God made them all. Yes, for me, He careth with loving tender care. Yes, with me, He shareth each burden and each fear. Yes, for me, He watcheth, ceaseless watcheth night and day. Yes, in me, He snatcheth from perils of the way. Yes, for me, He standeth pleading at mercy's seat above, ever for me interceding in love, untiring love. Yes, in me, O God, He sheddeth joys unearthly, love and light, and to cover me He spreadeth His loving wings of might. Yes, in me, He dwelleth, in me, and I in Him, and my soul with hope He filleth.
I'm on. There we are. If you didn't hear me, have you ever had one of those mornings where everything that could go wrong does? It does. It happened today, and you can thank Ella, who had some kind of meltdown for reasons unknown to anyone but her. So she, I don't know, Mommy was trying to fix her hair, but she didn't want her hair fixed. Maybe that's a woman thing. I don't have a clue, but man, it's just been a morning. But it's good to see y'all this morning. Glad you're here. We had a great week last week with VBS. The last night we had 81 kids and 210 people. So that was awesome. Each night it kept creeping up, which was great. And usually, honestly, Wednesday is kind of the night in the past when I've been a youth minister and been over VBS. That's the night you kind of see a drop-off. Because people typically go maybe where they worship and those kinds of things. But this year, that was our biggest night for the whole week. And I think part of that was they were loving VBS, but the other part, I think all of y'all's help with the marketplace and them getting to shop that marketplace and buy prizes with their coins they earned all week. I think they really love that. Except Liam, we tried to talk him out of it, but we let all the kids go through once and get one prize, and then after everybody had one prize, they could go back and shop for more, and Liam got a Star Crunch. And then ended up, he didn't like it, but that was his one prize he chose to begin with, and I was like, son, you're killing me. We tried to talk him out of it, but he wasn't having it. He wanted the Star Crunch. So, but anyways, we are in the book of Acts. If you want to flip over there, that's where we've been on Sunday mornings. And for everybody here this morning, thank you for being here. For those that help with VBS in any way, thank you. It was a wonderful week. I'm getting there in the recovery process. But it's been awesome. So we've been in Acts 13 into chapter 14. So if you want to flip to Acts 14, and we're kind of going through what is labeled the ABCs of Acts, where each chapter of Acts is a different letter of the alphabet. And you get to chapter 14, it's the letter N, and it stands for not gods but men. As you kind of look through 13, you had of course, the missionaries that are sent out, and you keep seeing coming back to a certain style of sermon, a certain message, a certain piece of content in the sermon message, and what is basically the sermon, the message that is preached from Acts chapter 2 till we get to 14. Jesus Christ and Him crucified, right? And typically, you're seeing kind of a going back to referencing the old law and God's plan from then till now, and how they believed that God had a plan, and they trusted that God would send a Messiah. They just didn't believe Jesus was that man, that He was the Messiah. What's one thing that kind of they struggled with? Why is one reason they struggle with accepting Jesus as the Messiah? What do you think? There's many, but it kind of links with our sermon that we're going to be talking about this morning. Jesus didn't always do what you would expect Him to do, right? And so His teachings weren't always just going with the flow of everything else and life and the old ways. And His teachings were challenging because it didn't just say, hey, don't do this, but instead it would call you to a different life, a different way of living. So, He says, you've heard it said that you should not do this, but I'm telling you to actually do something separate. So it's more than just saying don't hate, it's a call to love, right? And that's how Jesus taught, and that's how Jesus lived. And so one reason that they struggled with accepting Him as the Messiah is the Messiah was going to be the king, the deliverer, right? And Jesus didn't rule the way they viewed a king would rule, did He? Because to them it was power. If you're to deliver, then you're going to use power and force to deliver. But that's not how Jesus did it. So yeah, and they didn't expect someone to contradict them. They expected someone to come in and say, okay, I'm here, let's go. Instead of coming in and saying, hey, you're actually going to have to change the way you're living. You're going to have to stop doing this. You're going to have to, you've heard this, but this is a new law. It's a new covenant now. So they didn't expect that. They didn't expect that the one that was coming to be the king would be the one that would allow others to mock and beat and ridicule and ultimately hang Him on a cross. They didn't view any of that as kingly. And so you see a constant going back to, hey, remember, God created the world, and He has this plan, and He's going to send a Messiah. Well, that one that you've been waiting on, Jesus is that man. That's Acts 2. That's the sermon Peter preached. This Jesus that you just crucified is the Son of God. You hold David on this high pedestal, rightly so, right? But Jesus is the one that was coming from His seed. As great as you esteem David, Jesus is greater. And so you see a constant preaching of Jesus being the Son of God and a call to respond to that. Some won't, some will. We're going to see later on, there's two men in particular that don't, right? Agrippa and Felix. Agrippa's like, oh, almost you got me. Almost you persuade me. And Felix is just not right now, right? Not right now, maybe later. And he would continue to listen to Paul, as we talked about a few weeks ago in a sermon. He would continue to bring him in and seek his information of this Jesus and the call that God had presented, but he never would respond. And so I love that when you come here, it is a simple message, Jesus and Him crucified. I feel like today, when we think of talking to people about our faith and having that conversation, we get nervous for many reasons. And one of those, and I could say this from the standpoint of when I was a teenager and early 20s, and was the fear of, what if I don't know the answer? What if they ask me a question and I can't think of it off the top of my head? Do I lose credibility? Will they no longer want to have the conversation? Have I ruined this opportunity? And so the fear of not knowing enough would keep me and keep us from saying things. Has anybody else ever experienced that? Like being afraid that maybe you didn't know enough and they might stump you with a question? And the sad thing is, sometimes we let that fear do what fear does and paralyze us. Fear paralyzes us, right? It causes us to stop and pause and feel like we can't move. And our fear of not knowing enough, instead of remedying that by just studying and growing in our knowledge, I just don't know enough. And the reality is, if you're a Christian this morning, if you've obeyed the gospel, you've read through the Scriptures, you know what the Scriptures tell you to do to become a Christian, you've obeyed what the Scriptures teach about becoming a Christian. If you know what you did to obey the gospel, you know enough to preach Jesus and Him crucified. You don't have to have all the answers to every single question, to all the difficult matters, to all the things that are controversial or that require deeper study at times. You don't have to have every answer to every question. You just have to know, what did you do when it came to obeying the gospel? Do you know who Jesus is? Do you know your life before Jesus? Do you know your life after Jesus? Can you piece all this together? And if so, then you can have a conversation. And so here they just preach Jesus. Philip and the eunuch in Acts 8, Philip gets in, he just preaches Jesus. Peter preaches Jesus multiple times from chapters 2, 3, 4 on. Here you have Paul and Barnabas going and preaching in Cyprus in chapter 13, and they're preaching Jesus. And then you get to chapter 14, they come to Iconium, and they find out that there is some idolatry at Lystra, beginning in verse 8. So we're going to pick up in verse 8 and read here, but before we do, are there any comments kind of as we think through some of the things that I've just mentioned or that others have shared? Does anything stick out to you through the first 13 chapters of Acts? Yeah. There is a determination. So even when bad things happen, they kept pushing forward. And you see that when Peter is thrown in prison as they're preaching, they continue to push forward and preach. And you see with Paul and Barnabas, when they leave a city, they go and they preach. What about the early Christians? Earlier in Acts, we read about persecution arising against the church. And what did that cause the early Christians to do? I'll give you a visual. All right? They scattered. And if you didn't know, that was scattered. They scattered. And so as they scattered out, wherever they found themselves, they didn't stop being Christians. They didn't stop telling others what happened in their life when they realized who Jesus was and obeyed the gospel. They continued to preach it and teach it and live it. And that's a good reminder for us. Some of you have lived in McMinnville your entire life. Some of you have lived here a short time. Some of you at some point might move to another place, and that might cause you to gasp, there's no way I'll ever live anywhere but McMinnville. But wherever you find yourself, you are called to, as Matthew 5:13 through 16 tells us, to be salt and to be light. As you look at attributes of salt, one thing it always does is improve, right? So ask yourself, as a Christian, are you improving the area in which you live and work and thrive with your family? Do you make it better? Do you make the people around you better? Do you make their lives better? I don't know of anyone that puts salt on food to make it taste worse. Now, you can if you put too much salt, right? But wherever you find yourself, be salt. And wherever you find yourself, be light. Well, what does light do? Light shows you where danger is. Light shows you where safety is. And as you think of that idea of a lighthouse, it points out to the ships where the rocks are, so hey, avoid this area. But it also shows you, hey, this is where you want to go. This is the safety. This is the safe passage. So where you are, be a light. Well, how can you point out to people where danger is and where safety is? I mean, I guess you could just kind of stand and point and direct, but in a spiritual sense, you what? You have to have conversation and tell them. You know one thing that can make that easier? Well, one thing that can kind of open those doors, relationship. Developing relationship and spending time with people and getting... Now, you look here, they don't always have a lot of time to just plant, do they? When you look at Peter and Paul and the apostles as they're going and preaching the gospel. But as you look at where these Christians are that are being converted, they go out and preach. Now, if they've lived there your whole life, some of you know people here in McMinnville I still haven't met, and probably I might never meet them. And some people in this room probably don't know them, but you do. You have relationships with those people. So that gives you a unique opportunity to have those conversations. And sometimes, to go with that too, don't forget the love part of it, right? It's the two together. So I know we need to get into 14, but what Miss Jill said, that's one thing that blows my mind is as you continue to see them, they get persecution, they scatter, and then it immediately tells us they keep preaching. They keep telling people about Jesus. They have persecution, they keep telling people about Jesus. Not in a rude way, not in a rebellious way, not in a way that says, you're not going to keep me quiet because I want to rebel against authority, but in a way that says, you can't keep me quiet because like Jeremiah, this reality and truth of who Jesus is like this burning fire in my bones that's got to get out. And I can't contain it. I can't help that it comes out in the way that I live and the way that I talk and the conversations I have. Other thoughts or comments? All right? I've answered every question you've ever had in the last several weeks from Acts chapters 1 to 13. Let's go to chapter 14. We're going to pick up... we'll pick up in verse 8, but going back to verse 7, this is exactly what we were just talking about. Or verse 6 talks about them fleeing to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and to the surrounding region. Verse 7 is exactly what we were just saying. And they were preaching the gospel there. Wherever they found themselves, they were vessels for God. Now verse 8. We're going to read through verse 18 just because this is a whole thought here, a whole paragraph of thought. So we'll read through this and we'll kind of come back and ask some questions about what we just read. So in Lystra, a certain man without strength in his feet was sitting, a cripple from his mother's womb, who had never walked. This man heard Paul speaking. Paul, observing him intently, and seeing that he had faith to be healed, said with a loud voice, "Stand up straight on your feet." And he leaped and walked. Now when the people saw what Paul had done, they raised their voices, saying in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." And Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. Then the priest of Zeus, whose temple was in front of their city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates, intending to sacrifice with the multitudes. Now, we'll stop there actually, because I kind of want to point some things out. Anything stand out to you in the first 13 verses, or verses 8 through 13, those first few verses there? No right or wrong answer. What do you observe? What do you see? First, we have a man, and what's his problem? Crippled, he can't walk. For how long? Since his birth. Notice that most of the time, not all the time in Scripture, right? Because you have Jesus healing the woman that had the issue with the blood flow, but it only happened, it lasted for 12 years, and she was an older woman. She was an adult, so that didn't last her whole life. But a lot of times you see the apostles or Jesus healing people that had issues that began when? From birth. Now, what's interesting about that is it's a lot harder for someone to just say, or to doubt Jesus actually healing the person if they've known this individual since birth. You have this adult man who's never walked. So now if he starts walking, people are going to know this isn't some gimmick, this isn't some show to try to get money or try to rob people or trick people, right? No, they're going to know, hey, this man, I've known him since he was born. He's never taken a step. He's never stood up. So now you have a healing of someone that's had an issue from birth. There's a lot less opportunity for doubt. Versus me pulling someone in here you've never seen in your life, and they're in a wheelchair, and in my sermon I say, okay, stand up. And they stand up and they start walking. You don't know them. You don't know how long they've been in a wheelchair or not. Jesus went into places, and you have a crowd that gathers in the place from where they live, where they've lived. And Jesus would heal, and the apostles would heal people in their communities, and the community would see it, and they'd be blown away because they've known this person. This is a real miracle. So that stands out to me, a man that was from birth unable to walk. The next thing that stands out to me is Paul says, stand up straight on your feet. And it doesn't say he stood up, but the word leaped, right? And he leaped and walked. That's got to be some kind of feeling. Have you ever wondered that? He's never walked. Never. He doesn't know what it feels like to stand up. And now he jumps up to his feet. And he begins to take those first few steps proudly. Now, I wonder, those of you with small children currently, or grandchildren, or you remember when you maybe don't have grandchildren, but you remember when your children were small. Do you remember when they were first learning to walk? And they'd take a step or two and then fall, right? You remember the shaking of the legs as they're trying to gain their balance, and some of you are like, my kids still walk that way. I wonder if maybe that's how he was walking. Or was it just a fluid walk like you and I walk every day, because that's what we've done since we learned how to walk. He's never walked. And you know, it's not, I don't know if it's just as simple as he gets up and has a perfect, strut, a perfect step. But what a moment. And maybe it is that. Maybe he just got up and could all this, now miraculously, because this is a miracle, he just walks normal like he's done it his whole life. But there's a lot to kind of think about. Imagine the miracles of someone who has, have you seen the videos of the people who could see, but they're colorblind? And they make those glasses and they'll put them on their face and they can see color for the first time. You ever seen those videos? They're out there. You can find them on YouTube, or there's faith-based websites that'll put up those kind of videos as well. But their face, the moment that they see color, not even just see for the first time, but they see color, right? Imagine what it was like for someone who has never seen anything, and Jesus to open their eyes, literally, to see. What a moment. 4 friends bring a man laying on a bed, paralyzed, in Mark 2 to Jesus, and they lower him through the roof. Efforts, they can't get through the door, so they climb the roof. Now, you and I, you've heard, I'm sure, many sermons on this before, but it's not like a roof like we have today. They didn't have to climb a ladder like we have, but a lot of those houses would have steps to the roof, and the roof would be in pieces that you could take a piece off and move it. And so it wasn't like they were vandalizing the property and doing a lot of damage or having... Now, with all that being said, carrying a man on a cot, on a bed, upstairs to a roof, and then lowering him down from the roof to the floor of the other room, that would not be an easy task at all. So they do that, and can you imagine not just the man that's healed, but the friends that see, we got our friend here. He's walking now. He's not paralyzed anymore. When Jesus did a miracle, when the apostles did a miracle, there was no doubt what happened. No doubt. You couldn't deny it. And you know what's sad? A lot of people saw those miracles and knew what they were and refused to believe. There's people today that maybe you've heard them say, well, if I could just see Jesus in front of me, right, then I'd believe. Well, they did, and they didn't. And that blows my mind. But here you have this amazing moment where a man stands up for the first time and walks. Jesus completely changed lives. And the apostles going out in His name were changing lives with the gospel message. And the miracles were to back up and prove the message. That was their purpose. To prove, hey, I am who I claim to be, and I do have authority from God. Other thoughts or comments? Yeah. Yeah, you want to really have your mind blown, you can do a study of the human body and that will blow your mind. But if you want something that maybe won't stress you out because, you know, one of the hardest classes in college my friends took, it was anatomy and physiology. Now, Jeff and Lachlan, I guess that's their wheelhouse. But you know, it can be difficult. Just take a moment and dive into the animals that have been created, and look at the defense mechanisms that are in place in their bodies to help them live, and look at the way that they function, and like with a cow being born and being able to stand up and just, you know, yeah, they might tumble a time or two, but at a certain point they're up and they're walking. And it's just all of this from the miracle of birth and the way that our bodies function, whether it's looking at just the simple animals that aren't made in the image of God, or taking a moment to really just think about how complex our bodies are to function. All of this shows God's power and awesomeness. It really does. And it blows us away. You look all over and you can see God if you just take a moment to focus on what's around you. Other thoughts or comments to go with this as well? Yeah. Yeah, he could. I guess he could have been like, get up and walk, you know. But yeah, we have to decide to obey. And you look at sin cripples us, and it deforms us. You know, if we allow ourselves to be drugged deep into it, we look in the mirror, and you've heard people say this, maybe you've said it at some point in your life, you know, they don't like who they see, or they don't recognize who they see. You don't look like yourself anymore. Sin causes us to completely, to look completely different than who we were made to be, who we were made to look like. And sin cripples us. There's a lot of things that cripple the church, that creep in and cripple. And I have a sermon that kind of looks at some of the problems that can cripple the church, and that to help us be aware of that. But it's up to us. Well, I take that back. It's not up to us. God has done what he is supposed to do. But it is up to us to respond, to be obedient. I can offer you a $100 bill right now. Well, I can't, but I could. And if I did, I'm offering it to you. But you still have to get up, walk over here, and take it out of my hand. You cannot save yourself. Nothing you do saves you. But obedience to God is what saves. All the crazy things God asks people to do in the Bible, why would he do that? Why tell Naaman to dip 7 times? Is it because on 7 suddenly the water's miraculous? Is it that's how long it takes for leprosy to get washed off? It's obedience, right? We know why God told Gideon to use the 300 men, because he wanted to make sure Gideon knew and they knew, when you are delivered through this battle, it was because of me. Because there's no way you and those 300 men could defeat this army without me, right? But why did God make his people victorious when Moses, this is, maybe you could help me, fill me in on this, but you ever wondered why he made Moses hold his hands in the air during battle? With the rod, do you remember that? Aaron on one side, Hur on the other side. And every time his arms were in the air, God's people were victorious. But if Moses' arms started to drop, they started to lose. What happened? You have Aaron on one side, Hur on the other, propping his arms up, working together so that God's people are victorious. A beautiful image of teamwork, right? The thing with tying the scarlet thread around the window, yeah, that helps God's people see that and know, okay, that's where Rahab is. I'm not going to go there. But couldn't God just make sure that they didn't go there? Couldn't God miraculously intervene in a way that says, you're not going to this house? He could have. He could have made every one of them know right then, this is the place you don't go. But instead, it was working with Rahab. Why would God go to Abraham in Genesis 22 and say, hey, I want you to offer Isaac as a sacrifice? I mean, he's already called Abraham to leave everything he's ever known and go to a land he doesn't know, right? So why go the extra step in Genesis 22 and challenge him again? Testing faith. The more our faith is tested, the stronger our faith becomes. The less our faith is tested, if we're not careful, the weaker our faith can become. And our comfortableness in America, in our culture, it can lead to complacency and relaxation and apathy. And all of a sudden, our faith might not be as strong as we think it is. You know if it is when you're tested. And so, you look through all these different things, and God is saying, hey, will you trust me enough to do what I've asked you to do? And a lot of people will, up until they get to baptism. And they're like, well, I don't know about that part. I believe everything else God has said, but do I really need it? And I don't know why that's the hang-up, but that's one that hangs them up. They'll agree with everything else that you find people doing in the Scriptures, but they won't agree with that. Or they won't say that that's really a purpose, because they're afraid that if you do, then you're saying that it's a work that saves you and not God. But if it's the blood of Jesus that saves you, and coming into contact with that blood is what washes away your sins, then common sense tells me I got to find a way to come into contact with that blood. And the way that we do that is through baptism. And so you look at all of this, will we have enough faith to trust God? Accept and trust and obey. That's what faith is. Yes, ma'am. I think you just have to, well, it's like patience, right? Patience isn't something you just have. It's something you have to work on to grow in. And it's the same when it comes to trusting in God. Jeremiah prayed, but he didn't hear from God for like 10 days. And so it's hard because it goes against our culture. Everything is quick now, right? If there's somebody you need to talk to that doesn't live here, you can walk out in the lobby or walk outside on the porch and call them on the steps and call them right now and have a conversation if they pick up right now versus having to send them a letter later or something like that, right? If you need to know information, I mean, you can Google it. Google's never wrong, is it? But you can Google it and you can find information. And that's what, you go in the world of and I don't like this world, but just as an example, if you go into the world of politics, you can find any article you want to back up your position and then come and fight the opposition, right? But both sides have 100 articles to prove their point. And it's not just in that, it's with any issue you want to throw out. A big one, just a few years ago was the whole mask stuff, right? Well, here's a bunch of articles that tell me it works. Here's a bunch of articles that tell me it doesn't. And then you have people trying to fight each other because they go online and find the answers. But you go through all this and you can have all this information at your fingertips. You can have all these conversations immediately. You can have your food like that. So waiting on God goes against how we live, right? Some of you might eat fast food every day this week, and that's not a judgment. That's just, sometimes that's the way our life is, right? Getting kids from point A to point B and trying to just survive. And so it just takes a period of time where you're constantly trusting in God's timing and forcing yourself to wait on His timing, but living in the process. Don't just sit still and expect Him to work. Live as He's created you to be. I know we're out of time. I want to thank y'all for being here this morning. Make sure to meet someone new that you've not met today. That you've not met before, meet them today. And I've got to go grab the printouts off the printer for the sermon, so I'll get those handed out to you in just a moment. But thank y'all for being here, and other than that, we'll see you again in just a few minutes.
The future plans